Welcome to the Theology podcast. I'm Jordan Vale. In today's episode, we're going to look at the woman the church couldn't ignore. You just received a letter, hand-delivered, wax-sealed, carried across hundreds of miles by a messenger who is paid to make sure it arrived. And you? Well, you're the most powerful man in Europe. You command armies, you decide the fate of nations, popes negotiate with you, kings fear you. And this letter, well, this one's from a nun. Not a queen, not someone with land or title or political leverage, a nun living in a monastery in the Rhine Valley, who has never held office, never commanded troops, never been elected or appointed to anything, a woman who by every formal measure of power that your world recognizes has none. But you immediately break the seal, you read it, and you write back. Her name was Hildegard. She was born in 1098, the 10th child of a minor German noble family, which in medieval terms meant she was a tithe. The 10th child was sometimes given to the church the way you might give a tenth of your harvest. And this wasn't seen as something that was cruel. It was considered a real honor. It was also, practically speaking, a solution to the problem of too many children and not enough inheritance to go around. So she entered religious life around the age of 8, placed in the care of a woman named Jutta of Sponheim, an anchoress, someone who had literally walled herself into a small cell attached to a monastery, choosing total enclosure as a form of devotion. And this was Hildegard's world, from childhood, enclosed, structured, defined by walls. And it's worth, I think, just pausing for a moment on that image. A girl of 8, given away, people she doesn't really know, enclosed. And from that beginning, she would eventually become one of the most widely consulted figures in 12th century Europe. That arc does not follow the influence she'll one day have. So let's look at why. She had been having visions since childhood, and they weren't dramatic, theatrical kind that we tend to picture when we hear the word. No blinding lights, no voice booing from the clouds, but she described what she saw as a living light, a luminosity that existed alongside ordinary reality. Didn't replace it, but it illuminated it. She could see it with her eyes open, and it wasn't a trance, she wasn't asleep. She was simply, she said, perceiving something that was always there the way some people can hear tones that others can't. And for decades, she told almost no one. And that's the detail that tends to get skipped over in her story. She wasn't suppressed exactly. She was suppressing herself. She was 42 years old before she began writing down what she saw. And she only began then because, by her account, a voice she had been hearing her whole life told her to stop keeping it private. What had kept her quiet for 40 years? She called it unworthiness. She was a woman in a 12th century monastery, which meant that every structure around her communicated with remarkable consistency that her role was to pray, to obey, not to teach, and not to speak. She had no formal theological training. She could read, but probably not in the scholarly Latin of the universities. She had no credential that would justify being listened to on matters of theology, morality, or church governance. And yet what she had been carrying for 4 decades was not small. It was, and this is the only honest way to describe it, enormous. She began writing what will become scivias, a word that is a compressed Latin phrase meaning know the way of the Lord. It took her 10 years to complete. It's over 600 pages. It contains 26 visions, each described in vivid, almost hallucinatory detail, followed by extended theological commentary. The visions are not abstract. They have specific visual architecture, specific symbolic content, and specific doctrinal implications. This is not someone recording impressions. This is someone who's been thinking for decades about what she was seeing and had developed a complete theological imagination around it. While she was writing, she did something that could have ended the project before it began. She sent a portion of the manuscript to Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard is one of those figures in church history who was so influential in his own lifetime that his shadow still reaches into ours. He had essentially shaped the theology of an entire generation. He had launched crusades and ended papal schisms and corresponded with every significant figure in 12th century Christianity. He was, by any measure, someone you did not just simply write to. Hildegard wrote to him, though. She asked for his assessment of her visions. She asked him to tell her if she was wrong, which is, when you think about it, an audacious thing to do. You don't write the most respected theologian of your century and ask him to evaluate your private mystical experiences unless you have some level of confidence that they can withstand scrutiny. Bernard's response was measured, but positive. But more importantly, he passed the manuscript to Pope Eugenius III. He was attending a church council, and the Pope had scivias read aloud to the assembled prelates. He then wrote to Hildegard, encouraging her to continue. The most institutionally cautious organization in Europe, the medieval Catholic Church, which had every bureaucratic and theological incentive to dismiss an untrained woman's claims to divine vision, had just issued an official endorsement. Authority doesn't always recognize what's coming towards it. In this case, it had no choice. Over the next 3 decades, Hildegard did things that are difficult to categorize, even today. She composed music, over 70 pieces, more than any other composer from the medieval period whose work survives. And not hymns borrowed from existing forms, but original melodic structures with an unusual range and an emotional quality that scholars still find pretty striking. She wrote a morality play, making her one of the earliest known playwrights in the Western tradition. She wrote 2 books on natural science and medicine, recorded detailed observations about plants, animals, and the human body that reflects an empirical attention to the physical world unusual for her time. And she preached on tour, publicly, which that requires a moment to absorb. Women in the 12th century did not preach. It wasn't a matter of custom or preference, it was, in their minds, canonical. The church had formal structures, determining who could speak with authority in religious contexts, and those structures did not include women at any level. Hildegard went on 4 preaching tours through Germany and France, speaking in cathedral chapters and public squares to clergy and laity alike, rebuking corruption, calling for reform, urging repentance in terms that were not gentle. She was in her 60s at the time of these later tours. And at first, it's easy to dismiss something like this as an anomaly, a historical footnote, an exception that proves the rule, until you notice who was inviting her. The bishops invited her, the abbots invited her, the church institution that by their own rules should have been the first to refuse her a platform were the ones providing one. Something about her made official gatekeepers suspend the gate. And part of the answer is the visions themselves, specifically how she framed them. Hildegard was very careful and probably very deliberate about something. She never claimed to speak on her own authority. Her formulation was consistent across decades of writing and correspondence. A voice said to me, not I've determined, not my theological analysis suggests. The vision was the source, which meant that arguing with Hildegard was implicitly arguing with what the vision had revealed. And dismissing a vision required proving it was false, which required a theological process no one was eager to initiate against someone Pope Eugenius had already endorsed. She had found, or been given, depending on how you interpret her, a position that was structurally outside the system's ability to contain. She wasn't asking for authority, she was describing what she had seen, and what she had seen had implications. Influence doesn't always follow structure. Sometimes it finds the spaces structure can't cover. The letters she wrote number in the hundreds. Emperors, popes, abbots, queens. She wrote to Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor, and warned him that God was displeased with his conduct. She wrote to Bernard. She wrote to clergy she had never met, in cities she had never visited, telling them what she believed God required of them. And most of them wrote back. The content of the letters is striking, not for its mysticism, but for its directness. She was not obscure. She told Frederick that his support of an antipope was going to cost him. She told clergy who were running corrupt institutions that they were accountable. She told people with enormous power they were wrong, and then she would tell them specifically why. That's not what people in her position were supposed to do, and yet somehow, the doing of it didn't destroy her. It built the influence that made the next letter possible. She died in 1179 at around 81 years old, an extraordinary age for the 12th century. The process to formally canonize her moved slowly through centuries, as it sometimes does. Pope Benedict XVI finally declared her a doctor of the Church in 2012, only the 4th woman in Catholic history to receive that title, which is the Church's formal recognition that someone's teaching is of value to the whole Church, not just their local community. 830 years after her death, but the recognition when it came was unambiguous. We have a complicated relationship with authority. On one hand, we're suspicious of it. Institutions, credentials, official channels all carry a skepticism they didn't used to. On the other hand, we're still deeply shaped by it. We listen to people with platforms. We trust people with titles. We share things from accounts with larger followings and scroll past the same idea, sometimes said better, from someone with very little. And the question of who gets to speak and who gets heard, it's not an ancient problem that modernity solved. It's just taken on new forms. The gatekeeper isn't always a bishop now. Sometimes it's an algorithm or a publisher or a hiring committee. The logic is different, but the dynamic is familiar. Access runs through sanctioned channels, and voices outside those channels had to find another way. Hildegard found another way. It was not a strategy, at least it didn't read like one. It was closer to an unwillingness to let the container determine the content. She had something she believed was real. She had been sitting with it for 4 decades, and eventually she stopped asking permission to say it. That's not a blueprint. It's not a system that you can easily replicate, but it is a data point. She didn't have authority. She had a voice people couldn't ignore. And the longer you look at how influence actually moves through the world, not how it's supposed to move, but how it actually moves, the more you notice that those two things are not the same. They never really were. The most disruptive voices in history have rarely come from the center of power. They come from the edges, from people who, by every formal measure, should not have been heard, and somehow they are. Which I think raises a question worth sitting with. If we build our entire system for deciding who to listen to around markers of official authority, credentials, platforms, institutional positions, what are we missing? What voices are we training ourselves to scroll past? And what would it take for us, for the people around us, to stop waiting for permission to say the things we've been carrying? Hildegard, she waited 40 years, and then she didn't wait anymore. Hey, this has been Theology Made. If this one made you think about who you've been listening to and who you haven't, share it with someone worth hearing. We'll see you next time.